there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation that considers the question of whether life got better or not under the Nazis for most Germans. Now, we need to be aware that the answer to this question may change depending on three factors. First, we need to think about how we define better. Was life more secure? Did the standard of living improve? And even if the answer to these first two questions is positive, was the loss of freedoms worth it? Secondly, we need to consider different groups. And in this presentation, I'm going to consider three broad social groups: businessmen, farmers, and workers. Women, German youth, and minorities each need their own focus. And then we need to consider a third factor: the period we are looking at, from 1933 to 1939 or post-1939. In other words, before World War II and during it. But how far the war affected ordinary Germans will also have to be the focus of another presentation. Whether life was more secure, whether the loss of freedoms was worth any economic gains, you will need to look at what you've learnt in other topics in this depth study. But I'll point you to the kind of things you should be thinking about. Whether the one-party state and so the loss of democracy was worth the price of any gains. No elections where choices could be made to vote for very different political parties. No free trade unions either. And then there was the way in which the Nazis controlled Germans. The SS-SD Gestapo state. The Nazis' control of the courts. The concentration camps. Or were most Germans unaffected by this, and so not unduly bothered by it? But we should also remember what Germans had been through in the Weimar years. The humiliation of defeat and the chaos of the German Revolution. Humiliation and chaos again in 1923. And what they had suffered in the Great Depression. I well remember watching a documentary on Nazi Germany, and a woman was asked if she didn't regret the loss of these freedoms. Her reply was that before Hitler and the Nazis came to power, she had been free to starve. It left a powerful impression on me. However, the main focus for this presentation is going to be on economic gains and whether the standard of living improved or not for most Germans before the war. And let's look first at the business class. Big business undoubtedly benefited. It was the large manufacturers like IG Farben and Krupp who benefited most as they reaped the benefits of government orders for rearmament, while they also benefited from the Nazis' control over their workforce, and during the war from forced slave labour. There were lucrative contracts for the likes of steel, explosives and fertilisers, as well, of course, for armaments. Big business made substantial profits. Our evaluation is more mixed, however, when we look at small businesses and the middle class in general. On the one hand, the end of free trade unions helped businesses, as the German Labour Front worked with employers against the interests of their workforce. For although it stopped employers sacking workers without prior notice, at the same time it allowed businesses to pay low wages, and expect long working hours. And workers couldn't leave their jobs unless it was arranged by the government-run labour exchanges. Strikes were made illegal too. However, with little attention given to the consumer economy, and this was a big factor, many small manufacturing businesses, as well as shops, suffered. And the large department stores that the Nazis promised to close as they threatened the existence of the small shopkeeper, in fact stayed open, though Jewish ownership was ended. Businesses couldn't even raise prices, as these were controlled by the Nazi government. Food prices were controlled too. This was beneficial in that it kept down inflation, but it ate into profits. Now, the Nazis' great achievement, as far as most Germans were concerned, was in bringing down unemployment. It had stood at around 5 million when the Nazis came to power in 1933, and was down to only a little over 100,000 on the eve of war in 1939, though women had been removed from the figures, with many forced out of their jobs. The same with Jews. The worst of the Great Depression might have been over when the Nazis came to power, but unemployment wouldn't have been reduced so quickly and by so much without the Nazis' employment schemes. However, the reality was that though workers had jobs, their pay was low, very low on some of the government schemes, and their standard of living actually dropped. And as I've mentioned, they also worked longer hours, an average of 47 hours a week by 1939. But if they didn't take a job, they wouldn't get welfare support. And as I've also already said, nor could they strike for better pay or conditions, and they could even be prevented from leaving their employment for a better job. And with a shrinking consumer economy, even if people could afford to buy things, there was little to buy beyond the basics. And then things were often of poor quality. It was not a strong consumer economy. Again, as I've said, trade unions had been banned, and workers had to join the Nazi-run German Labour Front, which existed to control workers rather than fight for them. So workers' rights were restricted. However, the Nazis did also set up two organisations that did benefit workers: Beauty of Labour and Strength Through Joy. Beauty of Labour aimed to ensure health and safety at work, such as better ventilation and better lighting, and it introduced amenities such as washing facilities and low-cost canteens that provided hot meals. We may take this for granted today, but it was a big deal back in the 1930s. Strength Through Joy was part of the Nazis' attempt to create a classless society by making middle-class activities available to the masses. For example, sports activities, which included skiing, as well as the likes of football and swimming. I could add sailing too. It provided libraries, cheap tickets for concerts, plays and the cinema, hikes and other day trips, coach tours, cruises and other holidays. It even built health resorts and spas, and even built its own cruise liners. Millions of Germans took part in its activities, though the Nazis controlled what was given. For example, the majority of holiday places would go to Nazi Party workers. And there was always the dream, in fact a con, of a Volkswagen Beetle, the people's car. Workers were generally satisfied with what they had under the Nazis. But many of those millions who had voted for the Social Democrats or the Communists before 1933 would not be easily persuaded that any gains were worth the loss of free elections and their free trade unions. Farmers benefited in some ways, but faced problems in other ways. The Reich entailed farm law protected their farms from banks seizing them. Many farmers were in debt and struggling to pay off their loans. While the Reich food estate guaranteed sales of their produce. However, banks were now reluctant to lend farmers money when they could not enforce them to pay, and farmers found it very hard to get new loans for machinery or anything else. And though farmers had a guaranteed sale, the prices were controlled. Also, the hereditary laws were changed so that the eldest son inherited all the land, whereas before it had been shared amongst the sons in the family. Good for the farm, which didn't shrink in size, but maybe not for the second or third son, and many children left their family farms to find work in the cities. And because farms had been protected from foreclosures, there were less on the market to buy. So, winners and losers. In fact, much as the Nazis had wanted to strengthen the farming community, rural depopulation ran at 3% per year throughout the 1930s. Agricultural labourers benefited, though, when their wages were restored to the 1929 level and their housing was improved. So, though as always I can't provide as much detail in my presentations as I do in my ebooks, and in this case there's the effect of the war on the general population to cover another time, as well as the specific analyses for women, German youth and minorities. I think the big business, small businesses, workers, farmers analysis is not given enough attention, and you may well face a general question on the lines of, to what extent did German people benefit from Nazi rule? And you need to present an analytical approach, while you need to control how much you write. Well, I think this analysis gives you a chance to do that. As always, I really do thank you for listening. Cheers.